Hello! Today I'm going to be taking a look at the latest flagship instalment from Square Enix, Final Fantasy XV. Met with almost universal acclaim upon its release, 15 is a disparate compilation of story told over a range of mediums, which has drawn both praise and criticism from its core fanbase, and makes it in many ways a contentious instalment to the Final Fantasy series when it's considered, as a standalone game. And for my part, where I've previously discussed Final Fantasy games at length in the form of a measured review with a focus on character and story arcs, I don't feel I can honestly do the same with Final Fantasy XV because I'm still so confused about it in many ways. And that's not to say that I don't like the game, and there's plenty that I do like about the game, but there's much more that I found myself wanting to like about the game that it didn't quite deliver, particularly in terms of character and story development, which were formerly cornerstones of what constituted a good Final Fantasy game and expectation from this series. So I'm going to proceed to talk about the game, my positive and negative opinions pertaining towards it, and as always, anyone is welcome to contribute in the comments because I know that there's plenty of people that absolutely cherish this game, and honestly I would quite like to have my opinion changed about it, because I found myself really wanting to love it when it first came out. Now, to prefix this talk, and something that does, I think, inform opinions about Final Fantasy and a given Final Fantasy game, which I've previously discussed, is the generational divide that I perceive the Final Fantasy series to have, because unlike, for example, Assassin's Creed or the Call of Duty series, which build upon an established blueprint of gameplay and expectation, Final Fantasy strives to reinvent itself quite radically in terms of gameplay, graphics and story with each numerical instalment. And what this does in some cases is leave legacy players disgruntled with certain instalments, which inevitably kind of depart from the nostalgia days of Final Fantasy III or Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy X, for example. And not since Final Fantasy X have we seen such a radical change in gameplay and delivery as Final Fantasy XV. It's a huge disparate ensemble of elements. It has this sprawling Skyrim-esque world map of side quests. It has this new Kingdom Hearts style combat system that's been gradually introduced by Square, and it also has an unprecedented focus on extended universe material that already extends into a companion film, anime and season pass for secondary game stories. So this indicates not only an obvious marketing push on the part of Square, but also a concerted commitment required from fans to understand the full extent of the game's setting and story and mythology, which is one of the more contentious issues that I'll go on to talk about later with the Final Fantasy XV brand. What we also see in this game is a small and exclusively male party, which hasn't been seen, arguably, since Final Fantasy I. And this is interesting, as Final Fantasy is known for being popular with female gamers, and as we've seen increasing instances of emboldened and autonomous female leads in these games, from Garnet in 9 to Yuna in 10, Ash in 12, and of course Lightning taking centre stage in 13, I found it quite a curious departure from this trend, and I'm interested to know the reaction from the female fan base towards this, and whether they'd consider 15 more or less engaging because of this, or whether they even cared at all about it. So, concerning all these points and these radical changes, I was actually quite receptive to almost all of them, and felt they contributed well to the current generation of the Final Fantasy series. The Skyrim-esque style open world and seamless combat integration just seemed like a natural progression of what Square had been wanting to achieve for a number of years now, and the Kingdom Hearts Crisis Core style of combat is, a relatively engaging and intuitive means of gameplay, although I know there are some people that were kind of slightly put out that you didn't get control of the full party anymore. So that said, and just noting to the world map, I think I've stated previously in my Final Fantasy VII clip that I do prefer the earlier PS1 titles and the minified world maps, because what they've traditionally done is offer the illusion of scope without having to physically traverse the world in real time, and I find myself getting quite bored of games like Witcher 3, which consists largely, if not mostly, of travelling. And Final Fantasy 15 does kind of straddle this line quite finely, and particularly as you often have to sit in the car and drive around in real time without the option to fast travel, which borders on sadistic in my opinion. So, I did feel that there was a line that was potentially being crossed there. But looking at the world in general, Final Fantasy 15 is absolutely beautiful, and it's lovely to traverse, and the blend of sorcery and technology is done very well, and actually many aspects of this game remind me of Final Fantasy VIII, interestingly enough, which is my favourite game in the series to date. So, we have the car and the train as facets of story and travel. We have technology and these advanced cities superseding remnants of a magical past, and we have these beautiful European-inspired locales such as Lestalum, which really bears a current generation resemblance to Balam Town or Dole from Final Fantasy VIII, I'd say. We also have the character of Noctis, and at times he's seen to be a loner and somewhat detached and contentious, and this draws parallels to, but not quite to the same extremity as Squall Leonhart, and his friends exist largely to encourage and coax him towards fulfilling his destiny, which is much akin to the main party in Final Fantasy VIII, trying to help Squall adjust and adapt into trust and leadership as the game goes on. Another facet of the Final Fantasy 15 world I really liked was the profound and beautiful integration of the summoned deities known as Astrals, and where in earlier titles these were partitioned off into the battle screen and kind of operated almost exclusively there, Final Fantasy 15 offers them a real sense of scale by bringing them into the real-time events of the game. The magnitude of these beings, the sheer size of them, is simply fantastic, and also the effects of their attacks on the vicinity of the world just adds that little more tangibility to the world. So you have Ramuh's lightning, which scorches the earth around the battleground, as well as kind of destroying your enemies. So that sort of power and presence is really quite impressive. And although I will later go on to argue that 15 probably focuses too much on visual spectacle at the expense of character development and story, I feel that where they have focused on visual spectacle, it is done absolutely brilliant, and you can't knock it in this game. So lastly, on the world, the one thing I will say that I perceive as a negative was the rather bizarre product placement and commodification that Square seems to be introducing in their games quite heavily. There was quite a big deal made of fashion designer Vivienne Westwood creating Luna's wedding dress, and for those unaware, Westwood is a British fashion designer who emerged in the 1970s as a proponent of the punk scene alongside the Sex Pistols. And they made a big deal, and she designed this wedding dress for a video game, and there's also name drops and logo placements that I saw in Kingsglaive quite heavily, such as a Beats by Dre logo lingering on a skyscraper. And I don't really grasp the angle with this, and despite the relatability of Final Fantasy's modern cities, particularly they're quite similar to Tokyo, it is still supposed to be quintessentially fantasy, ergo not introducing anything of the known world. So I don't know, I found this a bit pointless and cheap on the part of Square, and a slightly uninspired and capitalistic thing to introduce. But that said, maybe I'm just reading too much into these inclusions that probably don't matter. So now, in terms of themes and setting, Final Fantasy 15 operates heavily on the concept of light and dark, the age-old duality of lightness denoting good and darkness denoting bad, and the very world of Final Fantasy 15, which is called Eos, etymologically taken from the Greek goddess of dawn, hinges around the notion of lightness prevailing over darkness quite heavily. Indeed, the etymology extends to the prominent characters of the game. We have Noctis, which is the Latin root word for nox, and this means darkness. We have Lucis, which stems from the Latin root word lux, which means light. And of course we have Luna, which is of course a word for the moon. And within this it hints at the intrinsic relationship between these two characters and this sort of fated destiny that they share. It's also prudent to note that Ardyn, who is a mysterious and, in my opinion, very well delivered and compelling antagonist, manipulates the Star Scourge, which is a type of calamity that extends the length of time in Eos. And this scourge can only be deterred by the presence of Luna, who is the Oracle. And, this is allegorical for, of course, she is symbolic of a moonlight and the lightness piercing through the darkness and keeping it at bay. The crown city of Insomnia is also etymologically significant because obviously insomnia is a word for sleeplessness, so it's a clear connotation of the vigilance of the capital in this game and how their protection of the crystal and protection by the crystal makes them largely impervious to the demons and the darkness, and how, as a society, they persist against the night rather than being consumed by it. So, overall, there's a very accessible theme of light and dark metaphor in this game, which in and of itself, isn't bad, and I think it works as a solid foundation for the story, and a game mechanic, of course, as well, because it introduces the day and night cycle. Another compelling theme in this game is that of sacrifice, and this ties in with the notion of friendship, which I'll talk about shortly, but one of the things I really liked about this game was the mortality and the fallibility of prominent characters, which you don't often see in Final Fantasy games, and how, particularly in the instance of Ignis, we see a poignant and permanent sacrifice being made that impacts his character for the rest of the game and story. Noctis and Luna are also prominent sacrifices made in the game, and where Luna's death had a sense of surprise and pity to it from that point on, it seemed after this that Noctis was just persisting in this morbid sense of duty and fate, and as soon as Luna died I felt quite confident that Noctis was going to have to fall on his sword as well, as it were, and it had this grim inevitability to his death and his sacrifice, which was really quite interesting as well. And for my part, I think these aforementioned sacrifices were well placed in the story and they worked well, but they would have worked much better and they would have had a lot more impact if there had been more development to the sensibilities and personalities of these characters and their relationship to one another. I was surprised by Luna's sudden demise, but her interactions with any other character in the story, excusing possibly Ravus, were so confined to flashbacks that by the time of her death I wasn't even sure who she was still, and I wasn't sure of the magnitude of the impact of her death to someone like Noctis, who hasn't seen her in quite a few years. So, I think they could have developed that character a bit better to get more impact out of her death. By way of comparison, we have Ignis, and this was someone who from the very outset is aligned to Noctis and Noctis's cause, and because of this familiarity to him and his presence and his clear likability throughout the journey, his blindness was a lot more harrowing to witness and have to deal with. And on the note of Ignis, this leads me probably to the most prominent theme and plot aspect we have in Final Fantasy XV, which is this sense of friendship and camaraderie embodied by Noctis and his friends. Now, early reviews posited them as a sort of boy band and a bromance, and it's true enough that these are, inseparable and quite uniform in their aesthetic, and this contingent of friends puts them firmly in the remit of labels such as, a bromance. But the driving theme behind them and the reason that they're so significant as a friendship is this necessity and reliance on good friendships to persevere through hard times and adventures. Going back to the all-male aspect of the party I noted earlier as well, it's prudent to note that it's hardly an all-male group in a overtly negative sense. This isn't a crude alpha male uni lad sort of group of guys, but rather it's an emotive and essential interpersonal alliance that sees these friends grappling with insecurities and indecisions, and quite openly display sensitivities that would not traditionally be regarded as masculine. And I'd argue it's only Gladio that really exhibits the stereotypical stoicism, strength and size of a traditional alpha male, and also Ignis, who kind of represents this grounded, logical disposition popularly assumed of the male gender during the Victorian era. But I will say, despite breaking the convention of traditional masculinity within this party, there's still some very clear stereotypes and tropes, particularly of a Japanese persuasion, that are introduced here. You know, we have Prompto, who is the obligatory excitable blonde. We have Ignis, who is this waifish intelligent guy, so of course he has to wear glasses. And we have Gladio, who is the big stoic moody bloke. So I'm afraid I don't remember the actual Japanese terms for these stereotypes, as I don't watch or read too much about it, but I know that they're quite prevalent in a lot of Japanese media and pop culture, and they prevail very prominently in this game too, and certainly much more so than any other Final Fantasy, I'd say. So the reliance on stereotypes in Final Fantasy XV has drawn some heavy criticism from fans. I mentioned that Final Fantasy VIII is my favourite game in the series, and this was criticised in its day for having a main party that you acquire almost immediately, and that all come from the same place, which of course narrows the scope for character growth and, you know, their respective story arcs. And I contested this in my Final Fantasy VIII clip by stating that, you know, the issues each character has grown up with, and, you know, these things that they have to deal with in Final Fantasy VIII, they do have their own segment of game time dedicated to resolving these issues and finding their way. You know, we have Selphie at Trebia Garden after the missile strike, we have Quistis in the training centre after the fire cavern, and Irvine during the assassination mission where he kind of loses it. And, you know, Final Fantasy XV does have a similar layout in terms of all of the characters having a similar origin, and we take control of them all immediately. The drawbacks I perceive from this, however, is that coming ready-made and ready-developed into the game from the very beginning, and their existence being hinged around Noctis and his well-being, limited the scope from their backstory and in-game development. And so, with only the stereotype personalities to fall back on, many fans have argued that they are quite two-dimensional and uninspired characters. And by comparison, in Final Fantasy VIII, you know, firstly, they all come from the same place, but, you know, they meet for the first time as adults, and they you know, they're unfamiliar with each other. So we have these story arcs where they're finding out more about the personalities of each other and things like that. And we also just have these little micro interactions and scenarios that complicate or complement a certain character in their respective growth. You know, just picking one at random, for example, we have Zell, who underhandedly takes a liking to Rinoa and wishes to propose to her. And it's just little contributing factors like these that offer growth in other Final Fantasy games that Final Fantasy XV sadly seems to lack. Now, the characterizations within the stereotypes that we do have is fine, I would say, and the humorous camaraderie of these guys that have known each other for years and years, you know, it works quite well. You know, we have scenes where the car breaks down, for example, and they're just generally discussing things of a light-hearted nature. You know, that's quite welcome, and it offers a degree of light-heartedness to what is actually quite a serious adventure for Noctis. But there just seems to be so much untapped potential within this, you know, and within the growth that they could have had, that would have made the game so much better. And, you know, there are some attempts at this. You know, we have Prompto kind of discussing girls, for example, which lends to this idea of him being amorous, or at least in want of some love. And, you know, we have Gladio and his sister, which offers a fleeting third dimension to his story. But despite having all of these set pieces in place and all this potential in place, I just don't think that they were adequately built upon, you know, in the actual story. And this leads me on to the companion content, and, you know, particularly the companion anime, which is regarded as essential viewing for filling in these backstories and these origin stories of these characters. And, you know, firstly, I haven't watched them because I simply, you know, the game didn't compel me enough to care anymore about these guys. And regardless, I think, you know, if you need to rely on an anime and, you know, kind of supplementary content to make sense of your game story, that's just really bad game design. And, you know, players shouldn't have to fill in the blanks themselves after they've played the main game about who these characters they've spent 40 plus hours with, are supposed to be. I just think that's quite poor game design. And I would say this also extends to secondary characters such as Aranea and Ravus, who, these guys have excellent screen presence and seem like very cool additions to the cast and story, but their agendas are so fleetingly explored in the events of Final Fantasy XV proper that once again it is down to companion content to flesh them out. Now, on a personal note, and just to make my bias quite plain if it isn't obvious already, I have traditionally disliked companion content and extended universe material, particularly when it's required to progress or make sense of a supposedly self-contained story. An example of companion content being done well, in my opinion, would be Advent Children for Final Fantasy VII, because not only was it a standalone sequel that didn't bastardize original game elements, but it had enough distance from the original release in terms of time and narrative chronology to be appreciated on its own merits. And similarly, we have the Last Order anime for Final Fantasy VII, which was, simply an embellishment to a part of the story that we have already witnessed and had discussed in the game. So once again, it can be observed or omitted by a fan, and without kind of affecting how they perceive the main game, and it doesn't detract or add to the experience of Final Fantasy VII proper, because it's so relatively divorced from it. And turning to Final Fantasy XV by comparison, which overall I do want to stress that I visually enjoyed this game, and gameplay wise I did like it, but we do see some examples of narrative events and character motives not making sense, due to their context being offered exclusively in extended material. And this was, as I've stated, my single biggest gripe with the game. So, to contest this, I understand that Final Fantasy XV is Noctis's story, and attention is rightfully on him for the duration of the game. However, if we look at aspects of the Kingsglaive movie, which is where we witness the character of Ravus being abandoned as a child, which prompts his contempt for the Lucian kingdom and his falling in with Niflheim, this is conducive to understanding his motives and attitudes in the main game. And, understanding what happens in Kingsglaive posits him as a much more tragic and misunderstood figure, rather than just some obstacle to overcome. And it also adds a lot more weight to his eventual death and demonification that, through the in-game events alone, doesn't emotionally impact a player quite so much, if we don't have the knowledge from Kingsglaive, which once again shouldn't have to be the case. We also have the character of Prompto, for example, who is a part of the main party, so warrants having his backstory explained, And we learn from the anime that Prompto's insecurity stems from his obesity and lack of friends, and, he has this friendship fostered with Noctis to help bring him out of this. And this is something that easily could have been accommodated, and probably should have been covered in the main game, rather than partitioned off to a medium that only appeals to a certain number of people. And actually, on the note of Prompto as well, we have probably the most poorly timed reveal that I've seen in games in recent years, and that's the moment where Prompto reveals that he's an Imperial clone, and he has this tragic and hitherto unexplored past. But as the player is about 10 minutes away from fighting Arden and completing the game, there's really no relevance or room for this plotline to be explored at this juncture, and I found myself hard pushed to care about this aspect of Prompto's past. And it probably should have been revealed 5 chapters previously, where we had time and and there was room to manoeuvre with that story arc. So yeah, frankly, that's probably one of the worst placed plot twists I've seen in years in terms of game writing. So, in a nutshell, the lack of in-game characterization and context is what I perceive to be the major downside of this game. And ultimately, I'd compare it with Star Wars, and I'd say it's a lot like watching The Force Awakens without having seen the original Star Wars films, because you understand that Princess Leia and Han Solo are somehow significant, but you don't really grasp why. And I think there's perhaps 2 reasons why this could have happened. The first being that Final Fantasy XV was adapted from the shelved Versus 13 project. So perhaps the story was rushed and they had to kind of crowbar in and repurpose a lot of these characters and backstories, and then because they ran out of time basically threw in all this extended after the fact, supplementary content to try and make sense of it. The fact that Lady Lunafreya is a repurposing of Stella from the Scrapped Versus project does make this seem likely. But secondly, it's possible that so much prominence in disk space and time was given to creating this open world immersive experience and these beautiful visuals that the scope for narrative and cutscenes and story basically lower down on the priorities by the production team, which for my part I consider to be the wrong way around, particularly for a Final Fantasy game. But they're my two particular theories pertaining to why this could have happened. So finally, I'd just like to mention Arden, because of all the primary set pieces in this game. Ardyn and his eventual reveal as a Lucian ancestor is probably one of the most compelling moments of the plot, and his affable, playful nature and uncertain agenda throughout the game juxtaposes beautifully with his ruthless killing of Luna, and show him to be a complex and highly interesting character with a very interesting kind of disposition and attitude about him. So for my part, I liked the cast, but found they were a bit two-dimensional. But I really, really liked Arden as a bad guy, because they just gave him this very appropriate sense of mystique and progression and purpose. And, I think it was good he was kept at arm's length for much of the game and only appeared at intervals as well, because his entire modus operandi throughout the game was to posit Niflheim and the Emperor as the main antagonists, while kind of intelligently working behind the scenes, in the guise of a middleman. So that was actually really good storytelling, and I wouldn't be surprised if almost whoever wrote Ardyn's character was not the same guy that wrote, the main party, because they just seem completely at odds, when we have these stereotypical flat characters and then we have someone as compelling as Arden, on the other end of it. So yeah, I think Ardyn and his awesome coat did salvage a lot of this game for me, definitely. So finally, I'd just like to comment on the music score for Final Fantasy XV, which was composed by Yoko Shimomura, who also does the Kingdom Hearts games, which is, again, has a fantastic soundtrack. And her compositions for this game are absolutely brilliant, and I think it's some of the best game music I've heard come out of the industry since Nobuo Uematsu or Jeremy Soule. The cinematic, nostalgic feel of the main themes, combined with the light-hearted Wild West vibes of the secondary soundtracks in the world map, are a massively redeeming feature of this game, and although it's only been out for a year, already instills this sense of nostalgia and warmth towards the title. I think the OST actually will assist 15 in becoming a very rose-tinted and nostalgic piece in later years, even among those that were put off by the characters and story. So I'm looking to conclude now on Final Fantasy XV. Again, I didn't intend this to be a conventional review or an overtly negative rant, but I'm just simply expressing this kind of conflict I have about what in so many ways is a fantastic instalment and progression of the Final Fantasy brand, but in other ways is such a failure to deliver on some essential elements and expectations of what should have, in terms of character and story. So in conclusion, I think Final Fantasy XV is simply a beautiful and very flawed game, and I can only hope that Square take into account the issues that many have had with this game and accommodate story as a priority in their future installments, whether it's in this dubiously received Fabula Nova Chrysalis mythology or not. So, I think it was probably a bad move to repurpose and re-engineer what were clearly characters and story elements intended for a different game. And yeah, I'd say this is probably attributable to the poverty of cohesive plot and character in Final Fantasy XV. So, once again, I'm very open to hear other people's opinions about these games, and I'm particularly keen to hear about whether fans of 15 would contest this idea that the story and characters are flawed. So please feel free to comment below with your thoughts and or contempt. And finally, if you like my content, I'd be very grateful if you'd help support my channel by subscribing too. which will keep you updated with my latest posts. And also as a one-man reviewer, it helps me gain a little more exposure out there, which is nice for me.